Hello there and welcome back to another Friday night. I am Rafael di Furia, back at it again, here to talk a little bit more about living life abroad, life in Italy, and life with dual citizenship. This week, I wanted to talk about something that, again, I have touched on before, that I don't think I've necessarily devoted a whole video to before, and that's what I would have done differently when moving abroad, considering the countries that I've lived in and also my dual citizenship. All these extra factors. I wanted to talk a little bit about what would have been, because they say hindsight is 2020. So now that I've got 11 years behind me, what would I have done differently? But before we get too much deeper into this video, a huge thank you, of course, as always, to the patrons who make these videos possible. You guys are really helping to make these videos possible every week, so thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And of course, if you would like to see more content like this about moving to Italy, Italian dual citizenship, and living life abroad, be sure to subscribe with that notification bell turned on. And if you could also give this video a like and share it with your friends, that would be greatly appreciated. Really, what it comes down to is that I couldn't have done anything differently necessarily. Maybe with some of the information now that I have, I would have been able to get my citizenship a lot sooner. But that's probably the one thing that I would say, my Italian citizenship that is, that's probably the one thing that I would say would have made the biggest difference in my itinerary, and even with the timeline of moving to Italy, what is it, just over 3 years ago now. Because as I've mentioned in other videos, the information available at the time when I had started was a lot less straightforward. I mean, this is not a sponsorship or anything, but really, I wish that Marco Permunian and Italian Citizenship Assistance, when I had been going through my process, I really wish that they had been around when I was going through all this, because that would have saved me so many headaches, because in the end, I did it mostly DIY. I did have a bit of help from time to time, whatever. It's a whole nightmare that I personally went through. But if we're talking about specifically the move to Italy, but it really doesn't matter what country you're going to, because again, some of this information will be relevant regardless of where you choose to move to. So what I would have done is I would have traveled a lot more around the country, because I, in Italy, only really know the north, I would say fairly right. I wouldn't say like I know it like the back of my hand, but I have a good idea of what things are like in the north. I'm not saying that I would have necessarily moved south, because as a younger person, I need to take into account making a living, and making a living in the north is supposed to be easier than in the south. But of course, it depends on what field you're in and what you're doing. But the work that I ended up getting into in my professional life, which kind of came into play because I just happened to be at the right place in the right time when it comes to video production that I used to do before moving to Italy. For me, the types of clients that I would work with would be more likely to be based in the north of the country than in the south of the country. So that was why I chose that. So even without having traveled around the whole country, I do wish that I had seen a little bit more and that I had the option, because that was the other thing. I didn't have the option to travel around as much as I would have liked and to get an even better idea of where would have been a more appropriate place for me to live. Because when I moved to Italy, I was coming here with a lot of financial restrictions. So basically, wherever I landed kind of had to be the place that I was going to live. So I needed to plan things very carefully ahead of time. And so having come here since I was a kid and having an idea of roughly the kinds of areas that I was looking for, I was able to make a somewhat educated decision about where I ended up choosing, and that was Alto Adige. And based on all of the information that I knew and that I could find out about it and everything, that did seem like it would be the correct place for me to try and build the type of business that I was building. However, the piece of information that I couldn't find out until I got there and had my boots on the ground was about the language. I knew that there was a heavy Germanic influence on what people would speak there, but I didn't realize necessarily that it was dialect. I knew that it would maybe be a slight variant, but there was so little information available on that. And this is something that I would say not only goes for Alto Adige, but for a lot of places around the country, that it does end up being important to know the local dialect, not only the proper form of Italian that people use written on paper, but like what actually people speak colloquially, because there can be huge differences between Italian or local dialect. For example, where I live, the dialect I find here to be very difficult to understand. Every once in a while, there's a word that can become a little bit easier just because it sounds a little like Spanish or a little like Portuguese. But in general, if I'm walking around the town here or people like strike up a conversation, that becomes something that I can't really participate in if it's in dialect. Because it's not only a difference that you'll find from region to region when it comes to dialect. Sometimes you'll find even from city to city there might be a dialect. And sometimes there's so few people that speak a dialect. If you're in just one little town, maybe only the people there speak it, and you can't really learn it until you get there. And there are even times, and I've heard this in multiple places, that people will speak their dialect because they do not want outsiders to become part of their social group or to become integrated. So that's the other thing. Whereas maybe in a larger city, you'll find a little bit less dialect, or maybe you'll find people that speak a little bit more standard Italian, so to speak. So those are things that do very much relate specifically to Italy, but there are a number of countries you could go to where I know that would definitely be the case. Like, I know if you wanted to go to some parts of Germany or Austria, depending on where you are, they might speak a little bit differently. Or, for example, if you go to Portugal, they speak one way in Lisbon, and then they speak another way down in the Algarve. Or if you go to Spain, they speak one way in Barcelona, another way in Madrid, and another way down in Andalusia. So it's not only about learning the standard form of the language, but being able to be in communication with people who are living where you want to live in the way that they communicate. But on to the next subject, the most important one, work, which I've touched on before. If it would have been possible, I really would have preferred to have a job before coming here. But unfortunately, that's not always possible. And sometimes you really do need to be in the place so that you can go for an in-person interview, or to be able to make social connections so that maybe you meet a person who has a job available for such and such thing. Jobs are one of those things that's never really guaranteed. But of course, if you do have a master's in a certain field, or you're very highly qualified when it comes to some subjects, then that will be something that will make it much easier for you to be able to get a job before coming here. Or maybe you work for a larger multinational company, and maybe you can get that transferred. And maybe that could be something that would allow you to establish yourself, because the beginning part of when you move to a country for the first couple years, that is the most difficult, not only mentally, but financially. And while you're trying to get things figured out, because you're still learning the language, you're still learning the new culture, you're still learning how to function in this society in a different country. Even though, say you're coming from a Western country, between different Western countries, we do things differently. And especially if you're coming from the United States and you're going to Italy, for example, there are a lot of things about the everyday system that are done very differently here than they are done elsewhere. And then even, for example, moving around inside of Italy, sometimes different places do things different ways. Even within a town, sometimes different places, different offices will do things differently than other offices. For example, if you're going to a doctor's office, what's common in Italy is that some doctor's offices, it's just walk-in services only. Some offices, it's appointments only. And some offices will have a mixture of days that it will only be for appointments, or times that will only be for appointments, and other times when it will only be for walk-in services. Just that's it. So that, coming from an American perspective, is kind of a strange thing, that you can just walk into the doctor potentially, depending on the doctor and depending on the office, to be seen potentially that day, rather than having to make an appointment a week ahead, 2 weeks ahead. And then not to mention the cost of the services, where in America, I don't even want to go into the pricing. Whereas here in Italy, going to see just a regular family practitioner ends up being a free visit. The first time I went to a doctor here in Italy, I didn't fully understand that. I had assumed that I had to pay like a small fee or something. And so when I was at the doctor, what I said to him at the end was like, okay, so how much do I have to pay you for today? He's like, no, nothing. I was like, what? Like, I had my wallet. I was like, I don't have to pay. And he was like, no, you can't bribe me. I was like, I'm not trying to bribe you. I'm just shocked that I don't have to pay you. That was just one of those experiences that I knew that medical coverage was a thing here, but I didn't realize necessarily to what extent that it went. But then going to emergency room at the hospital, that was something where it was necessary to pay, I don't know, it was like 15 euros. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head right now. But There are these things where there are those little differences that you really can't figure out until you're on the ground. But what else would I have done differently? I would have gone to school for a degree that would have maybe been in higher demand. Not necessarily medicine, but maybe something more in the tech or programming field, machine learning, something on this more specialized end where there is a high demand for it, where it would have been more easy to find work in that field in English. But that doesn't mean necessarily that I would have wanted to study in America. I probably would have wanted to study either in Italy or Germany, somewhere in Europe, so that the degree would be more easily transferable, or at least to do part of the time here. I know that coming from outside of the European Union and studying in Italy, because if you're trying to get certain certificates and degrees recognized, that can become a little bit complicated here. Sometimes, even if you have a high school diploma, maybe you have to do an extra year of high school here in Italy, or some type of program, a summer program, to be able to catch up to the level of what students here do in Italy, because high school in Italy, it's not a cakewalk. But this also kind of comes back into what I was saying before, that I really do wish that I could have come to Italy at a younger age. When I first found out about the Italian citizenship process when I was 12, my family was already talking about relocating to Europe at that time, and I just happened to hear a news story about Italian citizen, or actually Irish citizenship, and made an assumption that maybe Italian citizenship could be the same. And so that actually was, at that point in time, the plan that I would have done probably the end of middle school through high school and beyond in Europe, and more than likely Italy. Especially now, seeing how Italian social groups are formed at such a young age, I think that would have made integration a little bit easier. It still would have been difficult, and I would have been the American kid regardless. Now I'm just the American guy. So if you are someone who does have kids and you are thinking about making that move, should I do it now when they're younger, or should I do it when they're in high school, middle school, university, after they've already finished school, something like this? As somebody who did leave the United States at a young age, I do wish my family had left when I was younger because of the whole integration thing. But of course, you have to take into account other various factors, because they say at certain ages boys do better, and they say at some ages girls do better. There's all different kinds of studies about this online that you can go and read. But of course, by the time you get to high school, this is probably when it becomes the most difficult, because your kids have probably settled into some sort of social group of some kind within their school, and they've made those bonds with those kids there. However, if your kid is kind of a loner, and you're thinking that getting them out of the country and putting them into a new place might get them out of their shell, that may not necessarily help them either. That could also potentially make that problem even worse. It's one of these things that you will never know until you actually cross the bridge. But the last one that I do want to talk about today is being a lot more financially prepared. I was somewhat prepared for coming here, but because of the visa where I was living previously, and I didn't want to renew and get a new visa, I was already done. I was ready for the next adventure. I was ready for the new thing, and I was really ready to get started on my life in Italy. So really, between my own personal feeling, my visa situation of having to go and renew, which I really didn't want to have to go and do again, I would have had to move to a country regardless. So either it would have been to the United States, Italy, or potentially Brazil. For me, it felt more interesting at that time to come to Italy, or at least give it a try here, because it was something that I had always been so passionate about, something that was always so part of me, something that I always knew that one day I would end up there. And especially, I had fought so hard and so long for my Italian citizenship. I thought it would only be fair to myself to actually give it a fair try. But going back to what I was saying before about the financial side of things, however much money you think you need to be prepared, double that, even triple that, because there will be those things that you will find that will be completely unexpected. And how do you figure out what will be the amount of money you need? That's where you'll have to do the research. One of the most common questions that I get asked about moving abroad, especially moving to Italy, is how much is the cost of living in Italy? And in Italy, it varies greatly depending on where you are. Even within the Veneto region where I live, Where I live, it's one price. If you go to Venice, it's another price. If you go to Padova, it's another price. If you go around even to Verona or to Lake Garda, the prices change. They can change dramatically. Not that they always do. Or if you go to Milan, if you go to Rome, if you go to Palermo, if you go anywhere, the prices can change drastically, especially when you're talking about cost of apartments. Cost of food, that will depend more. That can be more north, central, south Sicily, at least the prices that I was seeing, sometimes depending on the area that you're in, because sometimes just an area will have higher prices for food just because that's what can fly there. I've mentioned this before. If you do a search on Google for cost of living, you can find what do certain things cost in an area, specifically like a specific city that you're looking to move to. Like what certain things might cost there. I have found that it's not always 100% accurate, especially when it comes to the cost of apartments. But if you want to know the actual cost of apartments, start looking on real estate sites. But especially right now, with the current global situation, you really do want to be careful of financially preparing, because I know some people who moved to Italy about a week before the lockdown came into place. And because of not being able to work and certain paperwork not being able to be processed in the time that they had originally planned for, it's now made it difficult and brought them to the point where they may have to return to their country of origin. So if you're planning to have some backup cash for 6 months, plan for 12 months, plan for a year and a half. With how things have gone this year, we really don't know how things are going to move forward, and especially with the whole world being locked down basically at some point or another during this year so far. Will that happen again? Will there be an outbreak of something else that will lead to that? And being prepared may be very difficult, especially now when so many of us have had no work or our work has been minimalized. Planning for the future has become even more difficult, and so I would say even planning to move abroad would in and of itself have become a lot more difficult. Also, the very last little tidbit that I just want to share in this video is don't get your heart set on one place too much. Don't lock yourself into one place being the only place that you can live. Don't have that be your only option. Be open to other possibilities of other places that you might be able to find, because sometimes when you arrive in a place, you may end up finding that there is a town just outside of the city that you were considering originally that maybe actually might be a little bit more appropriate for you. Or maybe you were looking at one neighborhood of a city, but maybe a different neighborhood could actually be more appropriate for you. So be open-minded and don't get too settled on just one option. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on another Friday night. And of course, a huge, huge, huge thank you to those of you who have been helping to make these videos possible through Patreon. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. And of course, thank you to those of you who've been watching these videos and subscribed to this channel. And of course, if you would like to see more videos like this about moving to Italy, Italian dual citizenship, and living life abroad, please be sure to subscribe with that notification bell turned on. And if you could also give this video a like and share it with your friends, that would be greatly appreciated. And of course, as always, I'm Rafael di Furia, and I will see you all next time. Later.